Well, hi all, hello, and welcome to a CISO's Guide to Mastering Cyber Incident Response. Now, today's webinar is sponsored by Security Scorecard and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Jess Steinbach, I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I'm so happy that I get to be here with all of you today because I get to learn right alongside you as we jump into the mind of a CISO and explore the importance of incident response planning. I think we all know that it really is when, not if, and a little bit of that forward thinking, the planning ahead, thinking through all the angles early on can save you so much stress, time, and of course, damage. But, it really comes down to the fact that we don't know what we don't know, right? And it can be hard to plan for all of those eventualities. So today, we're going to get some expert guidance on how to optimize your organization's incident response strategies. And this is such an important conversation. I'm so excited to bring our expert speakers on out here with us in just a moment here. We're going to dive in and get this show on the road. But I very quickly want to run through a few housekeeping points that will help you get the most out of our conversation together today. So first, I want to draw your attention on over to the questions section of your webinar console because the best place, the best part of being at a webinar like this is to interact with each other, to interact with our speakers, to pose those burning questions that you have, and to really get into that shared and collaborative learning that we can all have together. I'm already seeing some wonderful highs and hellos. Hey, Richard. Hey, Gilbert, Paul, Kim, Jorge, Andrew, Tony, Ed, Reg. We've got the whole awesome crew here with us. Hey, Kim, keep those comments, keep those highs and hellos coming in. I definitely want to hear from you as we go through our day today. And more importantly, our speakers want to hear from you. They want to get those questions. They are going to take some Q&A at the end, and we definitely want to hear from you as we go through. So please get those questions in. Now, you can also use that questions window if you're having any technical issues today. If something's malfunctioning with a slide or audio glitches a little bit for you, I'm going to suggest that the first step, if something like that happens, is a browser refresh. Try that browser refresh out. If that is not working for you, shoot us a message right there in that questions window, and the Actual Tech Media crew will be there to help you out. All right, so we've covered the questions, we've covered the highs and hellos, we know what to do if there's any technical issues, which hopefully won't happen, knock on wood. But hey, we're here to think ahead, right? That's the theme of our day together. And I do want to make sure that you spend a little time exploring that handouts tab. There are some really cool resources and takeaways. Be sure that you click around, get those, save those for later, because I promise you will want to spend some time with that after we wrap up our webinar. And it is not just awesome content that we are giving away today. We also have a $250 Amazon gift card as a prize drawing that we will give away at the end of our webinar. Of course, you do need to be here in live attendance during the webinar in order to win, and all winners must meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. If you're not sure what those prize terms and conditions are, no problem. You can head on back over to the handouts tab that we were just chatting about, click in, scroll down, and you will find the full T's and C's waiting for you right there. All right, well, that's it. We just absolutely breezed through our housekeeping, which means that it is time to get this show on the road, and I cannot wait to bring out, look at this dynamic crew we've got here with us, just an absolutely rock star panel that is going to dig into this conversation and really explore, open up that mind of a CISO for all of us and get into the heart of incident response planning. And to lead us through that incredible conversation, we have Dave Heller, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Security Scorecard, who will be talking today with Larry Slusser, VP Professional Services at Security Scorecard, and their special guest, Mark Dunkerley, Chief Information Security Officer, Coca-Cola Bottles Sales and Services. This is a very exciting panel. I can't wait to jump in. Dave, I know you're going to lead us through this conversation today, so I'm going to step back. I'm going to hand things right on over to you. Take it away, Dave.
All right. Well, as we're gathering here, so welcome everybody. We are very excited to be here with you today and talk about the important topic of incident response, in particular, how it relates to your third-party ecosystem and vendors. By way of introduction, my name is Dave Heller. I'm the Senior Director of Product Marketing here at Security Scorecard, and I'm going to serve as our moderator during today's session. And today we're going to talk about and hear about some best practices and incident response plans, why they are needed and why they're beneficial, really what's the value that they provide. We're also going to dive into how to effectively communicate internally in your organization and externally with vendors during this process. We'll cover some industry insights and best practices and overall really learn from the experts that we have with us today. And speaking of those experts, I'm going to bring them in here as I move forward the slides. We have two amazing speakers with us. Today we have Mark Dunkerley and Larry Slusser. So let's go ahead and do some quick intros. Would love to hear a little bit about your background and how it relates to today's topic. And Mark, let's start with you, right, as our guest here today. Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity to be here, and excited to share some experience. But so Mark Dunkley, I'm currently the CISO for Coca-Cola Bottlers Sales and Services. I've been within IT cybersecurity for a little over 20 years now. My role at CCBSS, shortened version, is to overlook the cybersecurity function, the entire function for that organization, along with we also do IT architecture. We're a smaller organization within the Coca-Cola system, and part of what we do at CCBSS is we provide shared services out to our North America bottlers throughout the industry. So excited today to dive into this very important topic a little bit more and share some experience.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Mark, and welcome. Larry, let's move to you. Let's give us an intro and some background.
Yeah, thanks very much. Again, thanks for having me. Excited to be here and and talk about this important process in this area of cybersecurity with you and Mark, particularly in the third-party space. My background in cyber is as an incident responder, specifically an engagement manager and ransomware negotiator. I've worked cases that are small and large and everything in between. My time at Security Scorecard, I have in the past run our technical cybersecurity teams, and then I've been a part of an effort to expand that into the third-party space. So there's a real need for keeping an eye on that third-party attack surface, right? So threat actors are now going for soft targets. The better we've hardened bigger companies and the better job we've done at protecting companies and their crown jewels, threat actors have said, oh, that information is going to a softer target where we can access the same or similar information and weaponize or monetize it over there. So again, really excited to be a part of this at Security Scorecard and work with companies like Coke, and excited for the conversation today as we bring some of these principles of incident response into the vendor space.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Larry. Let's go ahead and talk into the key discussion points that we have covered for today, right? So as we mentioned during the intro, and here are the key things that we will be touching on. First and foremost really is kind of setting the baseline, right? What is an incident response plan? Why is it important? What are some of the challenges that come with the supply chain ecosystem and working with vendors, right? That Larry and Mark just kind of touched on in their intros. And then we'll move towards ways to operationalize an incident response plan. And along the way, and I think this is really the benefit and the value, right? We'll cover some best practices, some key learnings from Mark and Larry based on their vast experience and knowledge in the industry and on this subject. So first up, right, let's start with an easy one, right? Let's get into the topic here. What are incident response plans at a high level, right? So give our audience some general context on what an incident response plan is and what its purpose is. And then let's start with, I don't know, you want to start with Mark here on this one? Just give us a quick overview.
Yeah, absolutely. So, incident response plan is, simple as it may seem to everyone. And the reality is a lot may not even have this, but incident response plan is, essentially a predefined, formalized document of everything you need, to essentially guide you through an incident response, within your organization. This will include everything from roles and responsibilities, communication plans, the incident response recovery process, who do you need to engage, forensics, cyber insurance, everything of that nature. Essentially, this is a document that will help provide you the guidance you need. So when an incident does happen, you're not trying to figure it out on the spot.
Awesome. Perfect. And Larry, I'm going to do a little bit of a piggyback off of your intro, right? Do these incident response plans take into account typically the organization itself only? or do they also take into account, from what you've seen in your experience, the supply chain and the vendor network of that organization as well? What do you currently see out there?
I think it's a really good question. I think most companies, the best way I could answer it is when I am able to speak to a group of CISOs or security professionals, one of the questions I do ask is typically, how many companies have an incident response plan? And raise your hand, and nearly everybody in the room raises their hand. And then we talk about, do you practice it? That's the second question. And maybe half the people raise their hand that they practice it, when they need to, or once every couple of years. And then we ask the question, have you incorporated what happens in a third-party vendor attack and your information is exposed? Is that a part of your incident response plan? And nearly every time we have nobody, maybe one person where they've thought about how a third-party attack could affect their environment. And then typically that incident response plan, when we talk about it, is more related to how they could be attacked through that partner or any of the large ones we've seen as far as Kaseya or that type of situation, or MoveIt, not necessarily what's going to happen to my data and how should I respond if that happens. And it does incorporate a lot of the same elements that Mark mentioned. It's just a different slice of that incident response plan. So I would say, less words to answer your question is no. I don't think very many companies are considering an incident response plan or a playbook to add to their internal, let's call it, cybersecurity incident response plan.
Yep, makes sense. And we're going to continue to kind of harp on that point a little bit here as we move forward. Thank you guys both for this kind of setting the stage. And, we're going to get into the importance of incident response plans in addition to kind of the comments we've already talked about. But, I like to start with the end in mind. What is the impact of an incident response plan? What and how does it positively impact the business and the organization as a whole? So either one of you guys can jump in here, right? So talk to us about the impact, the benefits of incident response plans. We have some key points here on the screen, but maybe Mark, what resonates with you, right? What's the end state benefit of these plans, and how does it benefit your organization?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point to discuss. So, really the primary benefit of, incident response plan having one in place is really having a more proactive approach, which I think a lot of the time we maybe lack the proactive side of things because we're dealing with incidents, responding, but it's important. And as part of the program I work with the team is we have a dedicated proactive function, which focuses on items like incident response plans. And as Larry mentioned, tabletop exercises and those sort of things, because they become a lot more important than maybe what we thought of 5+ years ago. So for me, getting into an incident, which it's not a matter of if, but when, unfortunately, the reality today is you're going to need to be somewhat prepared. Now, having an incident is going to be chaos, but how do you best manage that chaos? And that's really the benefit of this incident response plan. And as you see the statistics out there and, how things evolve, the data shows the more prepared you are and the quicker you can react and be more proactive, the better it is for the business long-term. And the quicker you can then support the business, get the business back up and running and get them into a state that, they need to do their day-to-day jobs.
Yep. What you said resonates, right? I think kind of controlling the chaos, right? Because you can do all the preparation and planning, but things are not going to go exactly to your plan to a T, right? So things are going to have to be dynamic and kind of controlling that. But awesome, thank you for that. But Larry, anything else to add on this? I want to jump if you have some things here, but also the stats that Mark just mentioned. I've got that was a good teaser there, Mark. But before we do that, Larry, anything else to add here as far as the benefits?
Perfect segue, and wasn't even planned. The only thing I would add is just to reinforce the tabletop exercises. A lot of companies feel they can do that internally, don't necessarily want to spend the money to bring in an expert who's been through an incident and understands how an incident response plan will work when you get into an incident. And I think that's probably the most important piece. I just really want to echo what Mark said. Companies that practice this, that have awareness, that have gone through the steps to practice, if we have an incident, here's everybody's role, here's the responsibilities, here's how we're going to communicate out of band in case the threat actor's in there. if you practice those things in advance, number one, you're probably not going to have an attack because it shows you're taking cybersecurity very seriously. But if you do, even if you don't refer to that plan, you've practiced it, you know the steps to take, and people are ready for their roles. And just as a personal side note, the favorite part of my job is facilitating tabletop exercises. and the way I like to do them, or we do them, is to absolutely emulate that fog of war, the stress, the having to make decisions on incomplete information. It's really an excellent exercise to put executive teams through if they haven't been through it before. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more people who have been through it, but practicing that is a huge benefit to an organization.
Absolutely. And we'll touch on this a little bit later too, right? Because things are constantly evolving, changing, the dynamic landscape with threat actors and their TTPs, right? So staying up to date on all that is just as important as going through the motion of practicing. So awesome. Mark, you alluded to some of the industry stats that are out there, right? So I thought it would be helpful to kind of bring some of those into the foray here, right? As you can see, some fairly significant numbers, and to drive this point home a little bit further, some of the research that Security Scorecard has done shows that 98% of organizations have a relationship with a third party that has been breached. 29% of breaches have a third-party attack vector. And then from IBM, it takes an average of 69 days to contain a breach. And oh, by the way, this is pretty intuitive, right? But it puts a number on it, right? Organizations can save more than $1 million by containing a breach in less than 30 days, right? So that kind of puts the emphasis on, knowing who's in your network, responding fast, putting that plan into play, practicing that plan, and being able to put it into play quickly when things do happen, because they are going to happen, right? They do happen and will continue to happen as far as incidents take place. And so the stats bring home, right, a significant percentage of incidents are occurring with an organization's third party and their supplier network. And obviously, the faster you respond and contain that breach, the better off your organization is, as Mark alluded to during his commentary. So this brings up that point again, right, and stresses the importance of supply chain visibility, the full vendor ecosystem. And I want to bring Mark and Larry back in here as well again. So, as we're thinking through visibility and suppliers and the supply chain, what are some other considerations here, right? What happens if you don't have full visibility of your ecosystem and who's in your network? Actually, you know what? Let's take a step back. What is full visibility, right? How would you define understanding and having the full visibility of your supply chain ecosystem?
Yep, I can go first. So I think there's a couple of components. 5+ years ago, I think the whole vendor third-party risk management, was there, but it maybe wasn't as necessary. And today is a whole different world we're dealing with. But the full landscape, I think, goes more to sort of your governance risk compliance, which is becoming a requirement for all organizations as part of cybersecurity. But as we go a sort of a little deeper, every organization within their cybersecurity program should have some form of vendor risk or third-party risk management program in place. If they don't, some of the larger organizations, if you're regulated, may already having this in place today. But this is becoming very critical, is having a program in place to manage your vendors life cycle, like you mentioned, from beginning to end. You need to build relationships with your vendors. You need to know who all your vendors are. This isn't easy because the business has traditionally gone out and maybe onboarded vendors, to do certain things. The reality is today, there'll not be a vendor out there that doesn't have some form of technology. So essentially, all vendors should be in scope of your vendor risk management process. This is going to require the need to have to do reviews on your vendors. When you onboard a vendor, you're going to need a very strict process in place to go through the review. You're going to have to be involved in the contracts whenever there's contract renewals, compromise vendors. And this goes to sort of how do you tier your vendors and have priority, because you're going to have vendors who have access to PII, maybe SaaS vendors. Maybe there has been vendors that have been breached. How do you categorize these? There's, you can maybe go to a multi-tier system, 1, 2, 3, 4. I typically recommend keep it simple, because the more tiering you have in place, the more processes you're going to need, and it becomes a little bit more challenging. So, think of simplicity, but it's going to be important, who your critical or important vendors are versus maybe the non-critical. But regardless, you're going to need to have some visibility into all of them moving forward. Is you sort of classify those important vendors that have maybe access to PII, integration into your systems, or SaaS vendors, whatever it may be. You're going to need to make sure you view their audits if they have them in place, SOC 2, Type 2s. I'm going to say questionnaires. I know questionnaires maybe doesn't have the best of sort of names, but unfortunately it helps us get a bit more visibility. So questionnaires. And then going back to the conversation we're having here, because vendors are getting compromised more and more on a daily basis, you need to challenge them on their business continuity plans, which then falls over the broader cyber incident response, disaster recovery. And, what does a business impact analysis look like for these vendors? We've probably traditionally done this internally with the applications and how we've been impacted, but have you actually done a business impact analysis on one of your key vendors, not being available? For example, something you may not think about, but maybe there's a vendor that you use manufacturing-wise. Traditionally, maybe you're not thought of this vendor of somebody you would need to from an IT cybersecurity perspective, but if that manufacturing process is down for a day, 2 days, weeks, how does that actually impact your company being able to maybe produce an end product, as an example? So as you sort of talk about this a little bit more, and the deeper you go, it gets very critical of understanding, your not just your third party, but what beyond that can also be impacted. And then even getting to the level where you've got to be involved in contract reviews now, in the language within contracts. For those vendors, every contract you have moving forward should have some form of language in place with your vendors. The right for you to be informed of a breach within a timely manner, the right for you to be able to collect, reports from a breach or whatever it may be, the right for you to challenge them and ask them for business continuity plans, the right for you to ask them to be maybe compliant with some framework, whether it's a NIST framework. But this language needs to be in all contracts, and obviously your critical will have a lot more detailed, SaaS type of agreements, DPA, those sort of things. But all this is part of our role in cybersecurity is a reality now, and we have to be involved in every part of the process. And again, it's not just a one-time event. As we onboard vendors, how do we continuously monitor them and using capabilities of, understanding their, external attack surface area? How are we reviewing that? How are we scoring that? And obviously, vendors like security scorecard are providing us much more visibility and much more flexibility. And really, the end goal for me is, how do you get to a point where this becomes a lot more automated and we're not sort of so manual? But when you look at the life cycle of vendor risk management, this has evolved significantly over the last 5 years. This space.
Absolutely. And I love that the kind of obviously tiering based off of criticality and all the different considerations with sensitive data and information that you brought to light, and then all the other factors. I wanted, and you touched on it real briefly, Mark, but I want to ask Larry to kind of dig in just a little bit more on the vendors of our third parties. So kind of that fourth party, the fifth party, the nth parties that are out there from a vendor standpoint. Talk to us, Larry, a little bit briefly on those considerations as it relates to the importance of making sure we have full visibility into our supply chain.
Yeah, I think that's really the key is visibility. We were focused on protecting our castle, right? The castle analogy, understanding that are there holes in our castle walls? Who are we allowing through the gate? Who has access? Protecting the crown jewels. I think we've moved on from that kind of analogy, as it were, to more of a planetary situation where we're exchanging data, we're exchanging PII and all the things Mark mentioned to businesses that orbit our business. And it's become more complicated, and visibility is difficult to gain. It's difficult for a lot of different reasons to have visibility into the businesses that we're working with who have our information and their businesses that they're working with, that fourth party, that nth party. And we need to understand who our partners, who our key vendors are working with. We need to understand their cybersecurity posture, and we need to know, as Mark said, as fast as possible through continuous monitoring if an incident has happened. it's not it's not necessarily if, but when. And I think anymore, it's not even when, it's now. We need to know now. We need to have systems and architecture in place so that we can react quickly when something happens and minimize the damage, not just for our business's sake, but for our clients, so that we don't interrupt their lives and our key clients and partners as well. Yep. Visibility is what I would say has become the new what we must have. It's funny, we use the term zero trust a lot in IT over the past few years, and I would say when it comes to our vendors and our partners, it's difficult to employ that. But I think trust but verify works, right? Mm-hmm. Questionnaires are a point in time. Even a SOC 2 is a point in time attestation to that environment, and we need more. As the world has changed and threat actors have changed, we need better visibility and better ability to react.
Absolutely. Yeah, and echo those comments, right? And I think that almost kind of bridges us a little bit to our next discussion point, right? And so based off of that visibility, we've got questionnaires, we've got check and verify, and how should we be working and communicating with our vendors? What does that communication look like? What should we know about our vendors, and what types of questions should we be asking? And we put together, kind of a top 10 list here, right? But a question to you guys both, right? But based off what we just kind of talked through, obviously all these are fairly important questions to ask. But are there a few that you might want to expand on a little bit, maybe provide a little bit more context or clarity to really kind of drive home the importance of communication with our vendors that are out in our ecosystem? And maybe Mark, I'll start with you, and we can touch on this one briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's obviously always a challenge when if you're onboarding a vendor, obviously, you've got vendors already in your system and maybe some backtracking, but trying to maybe get a sense of, I guess, risk pretty fast is pretty important to understand that risk profile and, trying to get to that point. But I think some of the sort of immediate questions that may come to mind is, number one is, have you gone through a major cybersecurity incident recently? Just to sort of help. Now, again, that's going to become more of a common yes at some point, as long as there's transparency there, because I think, like mentioned by Larry, it's not if when but now at this point, and dealing with this. But I think that's important, is you have that conversation and you understand if there was. It really helps drive a further conversation on, well, what did you do? What were your lessons learned, and what have you done to help, hopefully prevent that from happening? So I think that's a good conversation. I think I'm very big on, and I think a lot of the questions may cover this here for the most part, but I believe at this point in time, whether you're regulated or not, every organization needs to have a framework in place to work towards. If you don't have a foundation in place, you don't have an end goal, or you don't have a way to improve, where you are and show progress. And that's where a framework comes in. Now, I know that there's different places in the world, but like the NIST cybersecurity framework seems to be the least resistant for the most part. But that's sort of where I go next, is do you have a framework in place how you follow? And maybe it's the CIS controls, to some level, at least it's something. But I think that's a very important conversation, because that real quickly helps you understand if an organization is how serious they are taking cybersecurity. And that also leans on to, we find a lot of the times, there's a lot of organizations still don't really have dedicated cybersecurity functions within the organization. So that gives you a very quick sense of, well, hey, do you actually have dedicated cybersecurity resources? And there may be one or two, or maybe part of the IT function. But I think it's important moving forward that organizations need to quickly understand that cybersecurity is truly becoming a unique function. It's not part of IT. It's not part of another function. It needs to be realized fast, but there's a lot of organizations not there yet. So that tends to give you a quick sort of sense of understanding of the vendors and where they are when we first sort of touch point with them.
Absolutely. And Larry, anything else to drive home on this slide? Any key questions?
One of the questions I get asked a lot is, when you have these vendor meetings, Larry, isn't the vendor defensive when you reach out on on a client's behalf to talk about a vendor's cybersecurity posture or cybersecurity hygiene? Absolutely. When you're being measured at anything, it's natural to be a little defensive. And I think the spirit of collaboration, the data is the data. if we have some differences in opinion on the data, let's talk about it and agree. But I think establishing a collaborative mindset with your vendor, with your partner, cybersecurity is important. We know it's important to you. You have some of our critical information that obviously we care about, and we just want to talk about and understand how you're protecting that information. Sure that you are. I think that message goes a long way versus pointing out things that are wrong and demanding, remediation. I think how you approach those vendors and in partnership always seems to work a lot better. And then the data is the data, and we can just work through it and make them better. So I think these are great questions. I would just couch it in, you want to make sure you're approaching it the right way and not having it be a Q&A.
Yep, and not accusing, but more of the spirit of, kind of a continuous improvement and for the greater good. Yeah, makes sense. All right, so let's shift again, right? So you do all the planning, all the preparation. You're asking all the right questions with the right approach that we just talked about. And incidents are still going to happen, as we talked about. You have a breach, you're going through that. What happens next? What do you do? Let's talk about the incident response plans themselves and how to put them into action. And let's start with the different phases of the plan itself. And I'm going to start with you, Larry, this time. Maybe walk us through at a high level, these different aspects of the plan that we see here, and then Mark, I'll do a follow on with really some, maybe how do you put it into play within your organization. But Larry, kick us off here on kind of the key elements and the high level view.
Sure. You might have to remind me to stay high level. I have a little too much passion about this and could probably talk for the rest of the webinar. Preparation is the single biggest key in any incident response plan. And I say that because when an incident happens, everyone needs to be aware who the point person is. There's lots of different names: incident commander, person in charge of the incident. However you designate that within your team, you need to know who's in charge. You need to know who they report to, who that key committee of decision makers is. Is it straight into the CIO, CTO? Does it go to the COO, CEO level? You need to work that out ahead of time so that you have a decision-making framework, because there's going to be difficult decisions that are going to need to be made rapidly. And as many of those as you can work through building your plan and preparation just makes it that much easier if you have an incident. Then you kind of get into the nuts and bolts of an incident. You need to make sure that those who are monitoring your systems are able to understand how they escalate, when should they escalate, who's going to make the decision if we have a full-blown incident. Is it that incident commander person or is it someone else? Then you need to identify the team that's going to work to contain it, short-term and long-term. Mark mentioned insurance, which is a big player, as well as incident response teams. And then there's actually the containing, eradicating, and recovery. Are those internal teams? Are those external teams? A lot of different steps we could kind of talk through there. In my opinion, the most important piece, again, is to talk about who's going to do what, and who are we going to lean on if we need some outside expertise. Do a good self-evaluation. What realistically can we do? Where do we need some help? And I think I'll save my comments for if it's a third-party breach a little later. I'm speaking mostly about internal, but it would be a lot of the same key decision makers for if it was a third-party breach.
Yeah, and Mark, anything else to add here, right, as we talk about as it relates to putting that into play, right, within, maybe put it in a context into your organization? What other considerations or kind of overview would you cover here?
Yeah, I think that was very comprehensive. From Larry's perspective, I think as you look at the key elements of an incident response plan, just to sort of extend, it's extremely important that this has been documented and it's been put into a document. It doesn't get filed away. That's where the importance of coming into the tabletop exercises, and everybody listed from a roles responsibility needs to be around the table in that tabletop exercise. Everybody needs to be clear, like Larry mentioned, on who is, the point two person, because there's going to be a lot of things going on at the same time, as you have to work with external vendors, the cybersecurity insurance, forensics, whatever it may be. communications, how are you going to handle communications, who's going to communicate, how does that look, do you have media, making sure everybody's fully understanding. And that's what the premise of a tabletop exercise is to go through that, beginning to end life cycle. And then another point is, don't just make this plan and be done with it. You need to review these plans, and, annual may be enough, but it's important that if there is any sort of material changes needed, that they get updated, they get version control, and they get signed off, and that everybody is fully aware of what is involved in this plan and what's expected of them. And I think as we move forward to, we always get told we need to translate cybersecurity into the business terms. I think the reality is our executive leadership, our board members need to also understand the language of cybersecurity and these incident response plans of what we're doing as part of their jobs moving forward. So I think that's important.
Yep, I love that, not translating always into the business language, but also helping those understand the language of cyber and incident response. That's a great insight. Yeah, let's shift a little bit again to some best practices, right? So we've covered the importance, the general process, some of the key components of the plan, and let's dive into some of these best practices that you guys have seen in the industry, you guys have put into place, or things that you've seen others put into place. And Larry, I'm going to start with you again here. Some of the ones that I think we discussed during our pre-planning sessions for this conversation are on the screen here. Maybe pick one or two that kind of dive in there, and then Mark, I'll ask you to kind of follow on there. But Larry, what resonates with you most on the screen right now?
Yeah, again, so we're talking about a breach of your environment or your company's environment at whatever level. It's always a good idea, whether the people are on your cybersecurity team or your IT team, to have some folks on each shift who are able to take a legally defensible forensic image. It's not as scary as it sounds. It's not that difficult, and it's incredibly helpful. And it'll also save you money. If you do have an incident that needs to be investigated, you'll be further ahead for time and money. I could keep going. Mark, you want to jump in on a couple other ones?
Yeah, absolutely. Best practices here are very relevant. I think as we look at best practices and just adding some sort of real life experience and going through is, we mentioned the tabletops, and as we look at our vendor supply chain side of the house, we've already started executing vendor supply chain type of tabletop exercises because the dynamics is completely different as well. So as a best practice moving forward, you need to, sort of treat, the management of your vendors risk, like Larry mentioned, that incident response plan could be a playbook, but it's going to be a whole different set of procedures, and going through several, I can speak from experience, it's going to bring different questions, involve different personnel. So I think from a best practice, really making sure you understand the difference between, as well, your vendor doing tabletop exercises and all that helps to come back as well, to the best practices we have here with, these are great best practices, but it all comes back to the broader cybersecurity program, and that you just need to make sure, you have a very comprehensive approach to cybersecurity. And Larry, you mentioned as well, it's that sort of, let's go with a defense and layer, not just a sort of zero trust, but making sure you're covered in as many areas as you can, moving forward to be best prepared for when an incident does happen.
Awesome, fantastic, right? Thank you for that, and we're gonna move ahead to, I think this is, if I remember correctly, I think our last true content slide before we do some wrap up and answer some of the questions that are probably coming in. We thought it would be helpful to highlight some of the gaps that we're still seeing in the market, right? It's a challenge. First and foremost, it's a challenge to keep up with the changing regulations that we're seeing. It's the constantly evolving dynamic threat actor groups and their TTPs that are always changing and evolving, as well as the resources that seemingly are continued to be limited or spread thin and changing priorities, right? So, Larry, I'm going to bring you in here to really talk to us about the last two on this first list of gaps that we're seeing. Really, the point in time bullet point, and then really as well as the manual nature of what we're seeing in the industry. Give us some commentary and some additional context on those two.
Sure. I think everyone recognizes, and certainly Mark mentioned earlier, questionnaires were what we had. It was the first view into what a vendor or partner was doing from a cybersecurity perspective to protect our information. And as we've seen more attacks, large companies have been attacked, and that's what we hear about in the press. And when we dive in and we research and study that a little bit more, we learn that it was a third-party vendor. I have some personal experience with this in that I was home a few months ago, and my father came out one evening and brought a couple letters from his office. And he said, "Hey, could you help explain these to me?" And so I read through the first one, and I said, "Yeah, well, this one is your bank's letting you know that your social security number was leaked on the internet." Well, my father's in his 80s, and that was pretty troubling to him. So we kind of got him calmed down and explained that it's not really tremendously big a deal, but it was to him. But what he was more upset about was that even though the letter was worded very well, the bank let him know that the leak of his information happened from one of their third-party payment processors. And he was really mad about that. I couldn't get him to get off that point, because he said, "I trusted my bank with my information, and they gave it to somebody who they shouldn't have." And the way he worded that just really struck me. And it really started me on a process of how can we get better visualization into that third-party threat landscape to see, are our third parties doing a good job? How are they going to be attacked? And the second point that moment with my father brought up is that as folks in the cybersecurity industry, we deal with this every day. And even though there is a fair amount of publicity, it's not the only thing a majority of people think about. They're not as desensitized as we are. They see it a little differently. So I think as businesses in charge of people's information, PII, and other critical business information, we need to do as good a job as we can at protecting that. And so to that end, questionnaires aren't good enough. We need to find a better view to judge that cybersecurity posture. I'm a big believer that past performance is indicative of future results. So we need to find ways to better measure a company's past performance in the area of cybersecurity, because that's what we can expect from them in the future. And manual work, there's a lot of manual processing of the documents to go with questionnaires and relevant evidence in our cybersecurity assessment processes. Certainly AI can help with the processing of that, but we're not addressing the core issue of that information. Are we getting the quality information, the quality answers to the questions? Are we asking the right questions? We have some work to do there as a TPRM industry, and specifically in my part of the world is the cybersecurity piece or pillar of TPRM. And I think we still have some work to do there. There's a lot of exciting things. We hear about inside out, and I certainly understand that as one perspective. But I think my argument to that is a threat actor has to find a way in, and that's where they spend the majority of their time, whether it's phishing emails, whether it's looking for critical vulnerabilities or other ways in. That's where their focus is. So that's where I spend a lot of my time. That was kind of a long answer, Dave. Sorry.
No, you're good. No, it's all about the value and the context that you guys are bringing. So, as we move down the slide here, right, and driving this point home again one more time, right, the importance of including third parties. We've raised it a couple times, and that not all organizations and incident response plans are taking into account the third parties and vendors. But as you are starting to bring those considerations into your response plans, Mark, I'm going to ask you this question. Who else on the team, right? What other teams, departments should be involved in these conversations and these plannings in the building out of these incident response plans? What other teams should an organization be taking into account outside of what they've been doing normally?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, from an internal perspective, it's, you're directly going to be relying on your cybersecurity teams, your IT teams, your legal teams, general counsel. I'd recommend build a very positive relationship with those teams. And then your executive leadership team primarily are going to sort of be your main point of contact, as you build out, the plan. As we start looking towards the, third-party risk, it changes a little. You're still going to have the core, but it's not necessarily your internal business functions or IT. So it's a lot less. But now you're leaning more towards, and this is where it gets a little challenging, is, if you have a formalized procurement team or who manages that relationship with the vendors, it becomes very critical that, as you build out the plans and, do what you need to get in a good place, that's where the relationships are. You're going to find pretty quickly that it's going to be hard to get contact information. How do you reach out to vendors efficiently as things happen? This is where your procurement team or those who manage the vendors are going to be a critical component of whether you build a separate incident response plan or you decide to make it as an attachment of your current internal. But the procurement team and whoever manages those vendors are going to be very, very critical as you build out processes and as you collect contact information and build those relationships to be a lot more efficient when incidents do happen.
Yep. Awesome. And that you walked right into kind of that next point, right? The need for an evolution or a different playbook or, some type of amendment to the current plan, right? One that includes the players and teams that are relevant as it relates to the vendors and third parties. So perfect. Awesome. Well, that's our content for today. We're going to do a quick wrap up, and I think I'm going to pull up the questions here. Before we do the Q&A, any Larry and Mark, any final comments or key takeaways that our audience members should keep in mind?
Yeah, I can go first. I think as we've gone through the discussions, an emphasis on proactive approach now within your cybersecurity program. Make sure that's a priority. I think the statistics. I'm very big on statistics, and what you shared with us, Dave, is important. That should be enough for you as a cybersecurity leader who works within cybersecurity to help get you, the support you need to bring emphasis around how important this is, how we can be more proactive, and that you need to spend the time to be more proactive because, as you go through an incident, you're essentially, you're going to potentially save, depending on how big of an incident it is, but it could be millions of dollars by investing a small amount upfront. So I think, the proactive approach, being best prepared, but also just bear in mind that as prepared as you can be, there's still going to be chaos, but it's the better prepared you are to manage the chaos because every incident is going to be unique and there's going to be some different curveballs thrown at you as you go through.
Manage the chaos. I love it. How about you, Larry? Any final wrap ups before we do some questions here?
He just described a number of years of my life in managing chaos. I think it's fair to say in cybersecurity, we kind of have tool fatigue, lots of tools. I think as we move into applying that cybersecurity pillar of TPRM, as we recalibrate our TPRM programs, I'd like to encourage everyone to focus less on the tooling and the easy solutions that just take care of it for us. It's going to take some experts, some cybersecurity experts, along with some processes and some technology. I know that term people, processes, and technology gets used a lot, but I would really encourage exactly what Mark said. Take some time, talk through it, spend that money wisely that you need, because the risk, the potential risk is significant. The other thing I would advise is really understand your cyber insurance policy. It used to be you either had cyber insurance or you didn't, kind of covered what you needed it to. Those days are no longer here. They're very specific. They can have a fair amount of exclusions, and it's worth spending the time to really understand what's covered and what's not covered as one of your mitigating controls in insurance.
Perfect. Thank you guys both. Let's jump in to be mindful of the time here. A couple questions that have come in, and let me pull up the window here. So for any of the questions submitted that we don't have a full time to cover, we'll be sure to reach out individually. And thank you guys for asking these questions. Let's see this first one here. This one looks like it's probably for either Mark or Larry. How does one start with building an incident response plan? Say there's nothing in place right now, or there's not something that's very robust. Are there any tips or guidance on how you would get one started?
Yeah, I can jump on that one real quick. NIST, N-I-S-T, I think it's nist.gov, has a really good template to start with. I would just caution everyone, it looks pretty complicated. And I would encourage keeping it simple, right? What are the main topics, main headings? There are companies that can charge you significant amounts of money. I don't know that that's to help you build your incident response plan. I don't know that that's necessary to start. Give the NIST guide a good read through, and then determine what your organization needs for an incident response plan. And based on that, I think we have a decent guide. Also, there's other companies that can give you some free resources. I think the key component is understanding what you can do and what you're going to need help with, as far as if you get into an incident, what are we going to be able to do? Where are we going to need some help? And then work on building out your plan. And we talked about a lot of the key phases earlier, but you certainly can do it yourself and get started. And it's really critical that every company at least takes that step and understands what's going to need to happen if we do have an incident, because the odds are, if you're not going to, one of your vendors is going to in the next 12 months, and you're going to need to take action decisively and quickly.
Perfect. Thank you. Great, Larry. Mark, this one is clearly for you, right? It states, as a question asked, as a CISO, what are your top 3 priorities? What's top of mind for you these days?
Yeah, that's pretty common question these days. I think we hear for CISOs. So obviously this changes. Things change constantly. But current state, with where we are today, the three items that come to mind on how I look at the broader program. Governance, risk, compliance is critical now. Good news is you've seen a lot of companies hiring for this type of role. But for me, the governance, risk, compliance, especially when you look at the SEC and all the change in regulation, that for me is the glue between your cybersecurity program and the executive leadership team and the board of directors, because ultimately that's where accountability needs to live. But it can't without that transparency. And that's where a governance compliant risk compliance program comes in. So that's one right now. The other one, third-party vendor risk management. Like I mentioned, it's always been a risk, but over the last several years, we're just seeing an influx of our vendors becoming compromised. Traditionally, it may not have been a big deal, but now we're seeing compromises in vendors that are severely impacting downstream impacts, whatever it may be, production, services. This is becoming critical. So if you don't have a third-party risk management program, that needs to be formalized as its own function within your cybersecurity program. If you do have one, you may want to revisit it. And I think going back to Larry's point is we need to figure out how we get these to sort of automated and always up-to-date data to help us get a better risk profile of our vendors moving forward. And I think that's very important. And then the third one, this one will probably be a top 3 no matter what, is user awareness, training and testing. Data continues to show that at some point in a cybersecurity incident or compromise, I think 80-90% when you look at the statistics, it somehow starts from some form of user or human element, and we need to put a big focus around continuing to educate our users and essentially that cybersecurity is not the responsibility of the cybersecurity team. It's a shared responsibility now, and we all unfortunately have to take responsibility for cybersecurity moving forward.
Yep, absolutely. Perfect. Great answers there. I'm going to go back to you again, Mark. One more. This one is around, compliance and CEO or CISO liability. How do you think about liability as a CISO as it relates to cybersecurity and the programs that you guys have in place?
Yeah, I think this is probably top of every CISO's mind right now is the reality that, maybe, 5-10 years ago, you were in your job trying to do your best and something happens. Well, the reality is now, and not just necessarily CISOs, but even at the high, CEO level, we're starting to see instances where liability is coming to cybersecurity leaders, even executives to a level, and potential charges could come to us if there's any negligence found or anything that we're not doing that we should be doing by the book. And again, that's a lot for us to have to undertake. So it's as our roles continue to evolve, there's a lot more scrutiny, and as more breaches continue to happen, I expect to see potential of a lot more lawsuits in this area. And we right now are on the hot seat, so it's very important that we do everything we can, which is the importance of that governance, risk, compliance, that is really providing full transparency from an executive leadership to a board level, because we as CISOs need to really make sure that the accountability is at a higher level. It's an organizational level, executive leadership, board level, that in partner with the CISO needs to be realized, and we need to essentially support each other through these incidents that continue to become more and more at this point in time.
Yep. Perfect. Great. Thank you, Mark. Let's do one more here. So I think, Larry, this one's probably for you. So my organization has a TPRM program, but how do we continue to build up and improve the cyber component of that program itself?
That's a really good question. First of all, good job having a solid TPRM program. That's a great start, ensuring that you're onboarding vendors and working through all the different pillars of TPRM. I think, in my opinion, it's important to evaluate every vendor, not just your technology vendors, from how could they impact us from a cybersecurity perspective. I know there is some cybersecurity awareness training that comes along now with some TPRM programs and training. I would encourage companies to get an expert in cybersecurity as a part of their TPRM team, whether that is an employee or whether it's an outsourced company. You need somebody with that cyber perspective and expertise to help. And then vendors need to be evaluated just like they are for the other types of risk for a cyber risk. And that's, again, another program that would need to be built so that you can tier those vendors into levels of risk and into levels of attention that need to be paid based on those levels of risk, to incorporate that into your overall TPRM program. As we've seen cybersecurity, IT, the amazing internet work its way into all phases of business, we need to be accounting for that from a cybersecurity perspective in all the areas of our business. And we need to educate our teams, vendor managers, those that work with suppliers, contracting folks. Everyone needs to become more cyber literate as we start to really move into this next phase of digital TPRM.
Perfect. Awesome. Great. Thank you guys both. I think that's probably all the time we have for questions. As I mentioned up front during the Q&A session, for the ones, and there are a couple here that we didn't have time to answer, we'll reach out individually with responses. Just one last thing before we say goodbye for today and before we leave, I want to make sure that you guys are all aware that we've developed a playbook of sorts to cover this topic called the Third-Party Cyber Incident Response Playbook. I believe we'll include this in the resources section here, as well as a direct link to our website where you can find it and download it as well. And then one last final thank you to our speakers, right? Great. Fantastic to have you guys today here, Mark and Larry, as well as to our audience, right? Thank you guys so much for being here with us today and learning about incident response plans and the importance of taking into account the third parties in the supply chain, that full visibility into the ecosystem. And with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh man, well, I have to echo everything that you just said, Dave, and thank you for leading us on such an interesting conversation, to Mark and to Larry for some really incredible content. Dave, you kind of took all the words right out of my mouth, so there's not much left for me to say. One last reminder to visit that handouts tab and get that CISO playbook. Lots of great insight and information there. And again, a big thank you to our speakers and to all of you out there. And the one last piece of information that I will get to you all is our prize winner, because we do have a $250 Amazon gift card that is going to someone who is live, present, and as always, a little bit lucky here at the webinar. And that special somebody today is Akash Kumar from Massachusetts. Akash Kumar from Massachusetts, congrats. You have won a $250 Amazon gift card, so stay tuned for that. I will also remind you all that if you asked a question today, as Dave said, that if they did not get to you in the live Q&A, you will get a response back. So keep those questions coming in. I'm still seeing a few trickling in, so get those in. We definitely want to hear from all of you. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to once again thank Security Scorecard for making this webinar possible. A giant thank you again to Dave for moderating and leading us through that conversation, to Mark and Larry for bringing some great insights and information, really key actionable steps. Some of this can start to feel a little overwhelming, and I think today we really broke down how you can get started and how you can start to take action within your organization. So to all of you out there, the biggest high fives, the biggest gold stars, of course, always to our wonderful audience and to those of you who joined us today in this conversation. Whether you are the person who is setting the incident response plan at your organization or you're a key and integral part of it, we all own security planning. We all have a responsibility to keep that eye on the way forward. And that plan that we set in place is going to let all of us sleep a little bit easier at night, knowing that we have that response strategy that we've documented, tested, trained everyone in on, we've evaluated, we're reiterating constantly. And that's what allows us to get back to that peace of mind stuff, right? That's the good stuff right there. All right. Well, thanks so much again for joining in and being a part of this webinar today. I hope that I get to see all of you on a webinar again soon. And until then, have an absolutely beautiful end to your day. Thanks all.